Hey folks, hello, how are we? Good to go. Good to go. David Janetzki, Shadow Treasurer, Shadow Minister for Investment and Trade. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. I'm standing on the same piece of grass where I stood with Antonia, CEO of the REIQ, not more than 6 months ago, when we were speaking out about the renters tax, which would have put up rents in the middle of a housing crisis. And here we are 6 months later, speaking now about rent controls that would have the same impact. We're here because we're all united by one purpose, and that is to get on top of a housing crisis here in Queensland. And we saw the QCOS report yesterday, and they were alarming numbers. And no matter where you stand on the debate, fundamentally, good government and good industry outcomes mean more affordable and more available housing for those that are renting and those that are vulnerable. And we can't have a Queensland where, as the QCOS report reported yesterday, there's a 22% increase in the rate of homelessness. So it's important that we get that out front. That's our purpose. But the Premier's thought bubble announcement yesterday on rent controls was beyond the pale. There appeared to be no consultation, no modelling, and very few people seemed to have any details about it. And it was a reminder that when the Premier is cornered, she will say and do anything to get herself out of it. And the government knows. Rent controls, it's simple really, that rent controls will make the housing crisis worse for renters. And the government knows it. The Palaszczuk government knows it. And how do we know that they know it? Well, the ministers have been saying it. And I go back to a response from the Premier's housing minister to a question on notice from August last year, where the housing minister said, among other things, what renters do not need right now is poorly thought through legislation that could see a further reduction in housing supply in the private rental market. That's the housing minister talking about rent controls last year. Most recently, we've got a parliamentary committee report chaired by the Labor member for Mansfield, a Labor-controlled committee. And in that report, the member for Mansfield, in her forward, the Labor-controlled committee said quite clearly, rent controls are not effective in improving housing affordability for renters and can lead to distortions in the rental market, which result in poor outcomes for tenants, including reducing the stock of rental properties. So that's the government's own words. And what we're seeing more and more now is chaos. And at a time when the state needs steady and sober leadership, we are simply getting more chaos. And it's not the first time. So the Premier is abandoning her housing minister, the Labor chair of this committee, and it's a pattern now. The Premier, as we know, humiliated her Treasurer last year when it came to the renters tax, abandoning him at National Cabinet. We've seen it with breach of bail most recently, where the Premier had her ministers, the left faction Attorney General, the Police Minister, the Youth Justice Minister, all speaking against breach of bail, including, can I say, her factional ally, the member for Sandgate, just the day before, and then the Premier came out and announced that they would be taking our policy and adopting it. How many ministers will the Premier abandon before they say enough is enough? So let me finish by saying, from here, what do we need? Well, we can't have more thought bubble ideas. We need to increase supply. And the best way we can increase supply is through stable taxation and regulatory environments. We know that increasing supply is what is needed, and that will protect renters and protect those that are most vulnerable. And that's where we need the government focused, because at the moment, the Palaszczuk government is all chaos and no stability and certainty. I'm going to ask Antonia to say a few things, and she'll take a few questions too. Over to you, Antonia.
Thank you. Well, I think it's incredibly relevant, as the Shadow Treasurer has just pointed out. The last time we assembled in this way, we were talking about the proposed multi-jurisdictional land tax, which of course was introduced and subsequently repealed. This government seems intent on shattering the confidence of investors, those who do the heavy lifting when it comes to housing Queenslanders. It beggars belief that we're standing here today talking about a proposed rent cap. We've already seen multiple bills go into Parliament proposing rent caps, and those bills have failed. This government's own MPs have themselves conceded that rent caps do not actually address the underlying issue that we are facing, the source of the problem, which is an undersupply. Again, I don't think we can underestimate the impact that these continuous proposed legislative reforms have on investor confidence. We've had COVID-19, where we've seen eviction moratoriums introduced. We've had stage 1 rental reforms with further stage 2 rental reforms yet to come. Last year we had the multi-jurisdictional land tax threat, and now today we are facing a proposed rent cap. There's no doubt that there will be a number of investors out there who decide that it's time to call it a day. And we've already seen that happening. The Treasurer last year at the Housing Summit conceded that there are some 55,000 rental properties that have gone missing, and they're not sure why. Well, I can tell you why. It's because investors have had enough. If we want to have a conversation about rent caps, we say, let's have that conversation. Let's also have a conversation, though, about capping interest rates on mortgages. Let's have a conversation about capping local government rates, expenses that investors face. We've got to understand that here in Queensland, some 1.5 million people rent their homes, and the vast majority of that rental supply, it does not come from the government, it comes from private investors. So this is government once again biting the hand that actually feeds it, and it's rather extraordinary. We all know that there is massive strain in the market at the moment. We haven't seen vacancy rates this low ever in the history of this state. We're not pretending that renters aren't doing it tough. They are doing it incredibly tough at the moment. We understand that. But what we also need to understand that those that are doing it toughest are the most vulnerable, those that are mentioned in the QCOS report. We absolutely acknowledge that, and we understand, and what we would say is let's focus then on offering greater support to that particular section of the community who need it most. That's an intelligent response, that's a smart response, rather than coming out with rent caps for the entire investor community. Let's focus for a moment on the facts. The facts are this: if we did an analysis of rent rises over the last 10 years, what we will see is that rents haven't even kept pace with inflation. Those are the facts. We know that when we are in a healthy vacancy rate market, which is somewhere between 2.6 to 3.5%, history tells us that rents stay very stable. What we have at the moment is vacancy rates that are well under 1%, and this is why we are seeing what we are seeing, and scarcity is what is causing this problem. And frankly, rent caps will only exacerbate conditions. And for those who say, well, it's the REIQ saying that, it's the property industry saying that, of course, that's what you would expect us to say. Well, don't take our word for it. Listen to virtually every leading economist in Australia and around the world, and they will tell you that rent caps do not solve the problem. The only way of solving the problem that we face here today in Queensland is through focusing on supply.
What was your first reaction when you heard having a say rent cap?
Well, we were stunned. We were stunned because only weeks ago, months ago, we went through a parliamentary process which saw yet another parliamentary committee saying in its report that rent caps don't work. They don't address the underlying problem, which is, of course, supply. So we were stunned and very surprised. So, sorry, could you say that again? Repeat the question. I must confess I'm not familiar with that piece of research. I would need to look into the analysis a little bit closer to comment on it. But what I would say is that certainly if we look to other overseas jurisdictions where rent caps do exist, what we know is that it does result in owners not necessarily being committed to repairs and maintenance, to upkeep. We know that it can lead to the degradation of rental properties. We know that it stifles mobility. People tend to stay put. The list goes on. And I think what we need to understand is we have seen a mass exodus here in Queensland. The reason we're facing the problem that we're facing is that we don't have enough investment properties. Between APRA intervention, legislative and regulatory intervention, what we've seen is that investors have either sold or indeed have transferred their properties to the short-term or holiday letting market, where there's virtually no regulation, and of course there's an opportunity arguably to seek better commercial outcomes in some instances. I would welcome a conversation with the Deputy Premier about that, about price gouging. There's been a lot said about that. It's important to understand that here in Queensland we have very strict laws governing residential tenancy relationships. We have a provision in our legislation that makes it very clear if a tenant believes their rent is excessive, they can go to QCAT to have that matter heard. That's a statutory authority, that's an independent process. And of course we also need to understand that we already have a level of rental control here in Queensland. There are already statutory limitations on how many times one can increase the rent, together with a range of other requirements that must be met in order to increase the rent. And I think that's something that we should be more focused on. The government doesn't seem to want to be having that conversation. Again, the other point I would highlight is we understand that in many instances there are a section of the community who are experiencing very, very significant rent increases, and unfortunately what we know, it is the most vulnerable in our community who are experiencing those largest rent hikes. But again, it's important that we understand that there's a broader picture here, and so when we look at the data, what we know is that the actual average of those rental prices is not nearly as high as many groups would have us believe. So it's really important we understand that this is an incredibly emotive issue, but now is the time that we need to focus on the facts and look at the objective data. So, as a general rule in Queensland, you are not allowed to impose a rent hike any more regularly than every 6 months. In the case of a fixed-term tenancy agreement, that needs to be clearly stipulated in the agreement at the outset. You still then need to give 2 months' notice prior to introducing that rental increase. And again, even in those circumstances, if the renter believes that the rent is excessive, they can make an application to QCAT.
Any others for Antonia?
No, thanks.
Okay. Yeah, my mate. Look, at the end of the day, first principles, rental price caps or price controls on rents simply will not work. And the government knows it. more than anything, what we need right now is to appreciate how the market works, and I'm not sure whether the government's investing any time or energy into understanding how it works. Ultimately, the private sector needs to be helping the government with this problem, and it's not a time to pit one side against the other, and that's what the government fails to understand. We need the private sector to be working and investing, and what we need right now is that stability and certainty that I've been talking about. And if you're investing in property, that's a long-term asset class, right? That's a long period of time that people are wanting to invest into. And that's why that stability and certainty is regulatory certainty and taxation certainty is so vital to the future of housing in Queensland. And right now, the Palaszczuk government is all chaos and no certainty.
I guess there'd be some housing groups that would argue though for a rental tax that's what perhaps would do why you said there's so much uncertainty.
Yeah.
I'm sure they're going to be able to explain
Yeah. And Antonia's said and described that there are statutory provisions that protect in those environments, but more than anything, we need government working with the private sector because renters, homeless and the vulnerable are depending on it. And right now we're getting thought bubbles of gold medal standard badly. And what we need more than anything right now is that stability and certainty. A true consultation with the property industry, not pitting one against the other. And as I said, that QCOS report told us so much about what's at stake, and to develop a longer-term property industry where rents are affordable and housing is available is the primary objective.
Hey everybody.
Thanks, folks.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, folks.